Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. Is it working? I don't. Okay, great. So thank you so much to those of you who are with us in person and also the many people who are joining us virtually. I have to say I'm really pleased at the level of interest in today's event, which I'm sure has a lot to do with our panel, but I think it's also a reflection of our shared understanding of the need to address the drivers of migration. Today's conversation about the root causes is especially critical at this moment, an election year when the issue of immigration is highly politicized and policy discussions have become largely limited to securing the US southern border. This focus has come to overshadow the need to address the root causes of irregular migration, which, as we've learned over decades, is the only long-term solution. I was serving in the Obama-Biden administration alongside many of today's speakers when the US strategy for engagement in Central America was launched in 2014, which recognized the need to move beyond reactive measures and towards a proactive framework that tackles the underlying factors. At the time, the strategy focused on three pillars in the three countries of Northern Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the three pillars were combating poverty and promoting shared prosperity, fostering good governance and combating corruption, and addressing staggering levels of crime and violence. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the strategy was renamed the Root Causes Strategy very fittingly and expanded to include elements such as promoting human rights and labor rights, combating gender-based violence, and climate resilience and environmental sustainability. So today we're going to have the opportunity to take stock of the strategy and the lessons we've learned for the past decade from its implementation. What's worked, and also as important, what hasn't worked? What can we do differently? What can we do better? Throughout today's panel, let's remember that migration goes far beyond our southern border. It's a hemisphere-wide issue, and no single country can address it on its own. I think this is something that Ricardo will hopefully address. I think you're planning to address as well. Because ultimately, the conversation about addressing the root causes must go beyond Central America to include the countries in the Caribbean and in South America. To moderate our panel today, we're so fortunate to have Ricardo Zuniga, who has deep experience in the region and deep experience, I would say, in particular in Central America. Ricardo is the founding partner of Dinamica Americas, and he served as a career member of the Foreign Service for 30 years in multiple high-level positions that are very related to today's conversation. He served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. He was the U.S. Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle, and he also served as U.S. Consul General in Sao Paulo. From 2012 to 2015, this is the time when the initial strategy was launched, Ricardo was detailed from the State Department to the National Security Council, where he served as President Obama's principal advisor for the Americas and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ricardo. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Rebecca, thank you so much for that introduction. I think the main point that I would hope folks will take away from that is that you know who to blame for most of the things that have gone wrong over the last decade in terms of U.S. policy towards Central America. But look, we're going to get very quickly to our very, really excellent panel that we have here today, and it really is a top-notch panel. And I thank you very much to the Inter-American Dialogue for putting together this group. It's an incredibly relevant question looking back, and I think it's very important to do exactly that, take stock and make an assessment of what has gone right and where we could improve. I'm also very lucky, after having left government, to also be at the U.S. Institute of Peace and that for peace rather, and I think that also has given me an opportunity to continue to ask these difficult questions about, after Mexico, the most consequential area for the United States in the Americas. And there is one thing I really noticed, of course, when I was still in the policy world, was that when in US and Washington policy circles, there was discussion of Central America, thoughts immediately went to the US Southwest border. And it was a challenge for all of us to look beyond that. Rebecca, you, I think, flagged that correctly, that this is a comprehensive set of problems. There's also opportunities that we've seen realized. And I think it's also important for us as we look forward to think not just about the US policy component, but quite obviously the agency that exists in Central America, both for things that are working in the right direction in terms of creation of opportunity and promotion of democracy, and as well as the challenges that remain, that are longstanding, but yet are very influenced by geopolitical forces as well. So with that, why don't we just jump right to the day's event? So as I said, we're very lucky to have a great group here. I'm going to work from my left here, Eric Jacobstein, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central America and the Bureau of Central American and Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, excuse me. For me, they were Central American Affairs, but for Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, we've got Michael Camilleri, Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. We've got Molly McCoy, Associate Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs, the Department of Labor, and Arturo Aguilar, Program Director, Central America at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And thank you so much to all of you. And why don't we go ahead and get right to the discussion. And I'm going to start, Eric, with you. And I think something that is a really central challenge for all of us. What do you do as a representative of the United States government when governments move in directions that really run contrary to the objectives of the strategy that the U.S. has not only invested so much in, but really is counting on to help improve conditions on the isthmus?
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and it's humbling to be on a panel with you, given all your leadership on Central America, and also with this incredible group with Michael, Molly, and Arturo, and thank you, Rebecca, for your leadership on all things Central America here at the Dialogue. First, let me just say, we're really proud of the progress that's been made under the root causes strategy over the past 3 years. This is a tough set of issues, and we're not naive about the challenges across the board, including on governance, which is at the core of a lot of what we do. That said, the Vice President's leadership has been really crucial in driving success in a number of areas across the 5 pillars of strategy. And Rebecca mentioned the pillars last time around. This time around, we also focus on gender-based violence, have a standalone pillar on human rights, recognizing how critical those challenges are as drivers of irregular migration. So to get right to Ricardo's question, you asked about governments moving contrary to the direction of foreign policy goals. My view on this is it's really critical to remain present, remain agile, be able to seize on democratic moments. And to me, the best example here is Guatemala. We engage where we can, and we stand firm on universal principles when we see things trending in the wrong direction. So if you look at Guatemala back last summer, this is a country previously moving in the wrong direction, and now on a significantly improved track. And really one where I view an accident of history ultimately leading the country to a democratic transition. If the Pacto de Corruptos had determined that Bernardo Arevalo would make it to the second round of Guatemala's presidential election, they would have blocked him from doing so. So by remaining engaged and present, the U.S. was able to work with local partners to ensure a free and fair election, a free and fair second round between Sandra Torres and Bernardo Arevalo, and then to support the Guatemalan people at every turn as corrupt elements attempted to undermine the election itself. In this case, U.S. foreign assistance, including to support observation efforts, mattered a great deal, but so too did our other tools, including our use of gold Magnitsky sanctions, our visa revocation authorities, and U.S. partnerships also mattered. Don't forget the critical role that the European Union played, not only as electoral observers, but also in putting in place their own sanctions. And so this was a time where we were able to ensure that we were present and agile and had the resources on the ground to have an impact. But I would say that, especially in Guatemala, lawfare there and really throughout the region remains a major challenge. The Guatemalan Attorney General, it's no secret, has been a huge challenge, obstacle to progress in the country. But I'm pleased that there's other tools out there to deal with some of the issues that we have concerning the judiciary. The OAS is sending an observation mission. We also think of the OAS as on its leadership in terms of monitoring elections. But the OAS is sending a first of its kind, really, observation mission to Guatemala this month through October that will observe the judicial selection process. And that's a recognition of how important it is for the region to acknowledge the role that attorneys general play, that judges play moving forward. And we think that that's just so important. And, finally, let me just say on Guatemala, and just we'll say a quick word about the other countries before passing it on. But I think being present, being agile in those moments allowed us to get to the moments we are today, where there's a lot of momentum, where the U.S. is really going all in. We had the first ever high-level economic dialogue early this year. The president and vice president have both met with President Revelo. Guatemala hosted the Los Angeles Declaration ministerial meeting on migration management. Secretary Mayorkas was in Guatemala. So the engagement's happening at all levels. And, I think there's a real opportunity to collaborate with this new government to find ways to show that democracy can deliver. So, I would say just briefly that, there's also promising collaboration across the board. In Honduras, last month, we signed the first ever compact on gender-based violence, which, as I noted, is a huge driver on migration. And on the economic front, working with the Honduran government to promote a logistics corridor, which is much needed. And in El Salvador, we're working to advance secure technologies and 5G, and also looking to partner to find a path back to citizen security with due process, which is obviously critical. So look forward to digging in more on these issues, but I think there are real opportunities if we stay engaged and stay agile at the right moments.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And I think that you mentioned a couple of times that part of this engagement has been on the economic front. I've noticed Jose Fernandez has spent a great deal of time in Central America as well. Certainly the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, has spent a great deal of time on the economic front as well. It's about creation of opportunity and hope when you talk about the root causes and drivers of migration. So I would ask two of you, Molly and Michael, if perhaps you could share some thoughts on some of the economic areas of engagement where the U.S. has learned about how to promote opportunity using both local resources and multilateral ones. Michael, let me start with you, and then Molly.
Thanks, Ricardo. No? How about now? Good. All right. Well, thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, Rebecca, for the invitation here. Great to be back at the dialogue for this conversation, and to do so in such a distinguished company. I think, as Eric mentioned, we are proud of the progress we've made, though clearly, many challenges still to address. Maybe principal among them, at least based on what the data tells us about why individuals are making the difficult and dangerous decisions to migrate, is precisely the one you asked about, Ricardo, which is lack of economic opportunity, which still is the major driver within Central America, at least, of irregular migration. So maybe let me make sort of 4 points on this in terms of how we think about it, and I'll sort of start with the broadest aperture and get more narrow. Big picture, I would say the business enabling environment really matters. So before we even get into the specifics of kind of the firm level considerations here, things like rule of law, legal certainty, physical security, public infrastructure, certainly addressing corruption. All of these things matter when it comes to building an enabling environment for economic growth and inclusive economic growth. And you see there kind of the intersections with the other pillars of the root causes strategy. The second thing I would say is that we really need to be intentional about inclusive economic growth. It's probably no secret to folks in this room that we are dealing in Latin America broadly and Central America particularly with high levels of income inequality, with access to capital and opportunity being uh, very highly concentrated in many cases. And so when we think about economic opportunity, it's not just about growing GDPs and hoping that trickles down, but actually being intentional about driving capital and opportunity to those indigenous communities, women, youth who have not had access traditionally to those kinds of opportunities. And so just a few examples of how we do this. In Guatemala, for example, we call it our JEDI activity, but which facilitates business support services to entrepreneurs with a particular focus on the needs of women and indigenous people, rural communities, youth, high concentration of economic program in the Western Highlands and increasingly in the Verapaces, working with new business groups like the Consejo Nacional Empresarial to get out of just the kind of traditional business elite groupings. And very recently, you may have seen on the sidelines or in the context of the migration ministerial in Guatemala, a new USAID facilitated DFC loan that works with actually a co-op to provide support for low income mortgages for first home borrowers in rural Guatemala. So really trying to be thoughtful and intentional about bringing increased economic activity and opportunity to those who have not had it traditionally. Third point, and I'll be quick on this, but just I think it goes without saying that for anything to be done at scale, it needs to be market driven. And so bringing that conviction and that approach to everything we do in the economic space, the Vice President's leadership, of course, on Central America Forward and mobilizing private investment in the region is perhaps Exhibit A for this. And then in terms of the kind of programmatic interventions, taking a sort of a soup to nuts approach. So that starts with what we do in the basic education space. It includes vocational training, which just in the last year reached 15,000 students in such programs in Central America. It means creating jobs at sort of the firm level, so supporting, since the launch of this strategy, 12,000 firms in Central America to create or sustain 70,000 jobs. And then working in some cases directly with those who are creating businesses, whether that's with access to financial credit, such as a partnership with Back Credomatic in El Salvador, or working directly with smallholder farmers to help them sell their products at a stable price. So I think what we see, and I'm sure we'll get into this in terms of the broad migration trend lines from the region, but also the specific data that we're getting out of our programmatic interventions is actually a concrete impact on what we ultimately want to achieve, which is providing opportunities that allow people in the region to see futures for themselves at home and not have to consider the very difficult, painful, awful, dangerous decision to undertake irregular migration.
So Molly, that is I think a great way to introduce the work that the Department of Labor has done in Central America, which is, I think, maybe doesn't get the same level of profile, but has been really crucial to the work of the administration, not just in terms of the temporary labor programs and the role in the United States, but also in terms of promoting best practices on the labor front in Central America. Could you share a little bit about your perspective on how that has been?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Ricardo. And that is a perfect segue. So thanks, Michael. Just like we planned it. You heard both Rebecca and Eric mention that the root causes strategy has evolved from a sort of three-pillar focus on economic growth, governance, and security to a broader approach that includes a focus on labor rights within the context of human rights and addressing gender-based violence. And I think Michael just said something similar, that GDP growth alone won't get us there. And that's what this broader strategy recognizes, that inclusive economic growth, growth that supports families, growth that citizens can actually access and benefit for, is crucial to building the sort of stable communities that people need to see and that people want to invest in. And so for us at the Department of Labor, that means making sure that we are supporting policies that encourage job quality and decent work, safe jobs, including protection from occupational illnesses and accidents, freedom from gender-based violence and harassment. All of those are critical to providing stable livelihoods that underpin stable communities and then in turn democratic societies. And within that, we take a special focus in this administration on labor rights, and specifically freedom of association and the right to bargain collectively as enabling rights that help workers attain all of those other things. So our approach not only recognizes the value of freedom of association, but actively promotes collective worker voice as key to good jobs and thriving industries. And I'll mention now just a few of the tools that we are using. We don't work with the same budget that USAID works. We don't work necessarily with the same diplomatic influence that the Department of State works, but we have some very targeted interventions that reach workers and reach worker organizations and enable us to make real change on the ground. So folks are probably familiar with trade agreements and the sort of hard tools that we have there in terms of trade and complaints. Trade agreements, including CAFTA-DR, also give us a space for cooperation. So we're working right now with the Guatemalan government to explore, through our cooperative mechanisms under CAFTA, ways to improve labor law enforcement. Through Central America Forward, we're able to work with our interagency colleagues and the private sector and civil society in ways that we haven't previously. So I think almost exactly a year to the date, we went with some of our colleagues in leadership from the interagency on a sort of delegation fact-finding mission, looking at gender-based violence and harassment and women's economic empowerment in Central America. So there's more than 4.2 billion in private sector commitments to create economic opportunities in Northern Central America. We went to meet with businesses, with the Partnership for Central America, with worker organizations, community organizations, to understand the challenges that women workers are facing and how union representation, good jobs, access to job opportunities enable workers, especially those that have been historically marginalized, to thrive and to negotiate for their rights, to have a voice at work and a safe job. As a result of that experience, we're integrating a lot of that in the technical assistance, so the programs that we fund in Central America. And you'll see this moving forward anytime you see a program coming out of Department of Labor. We are continuing to do research and reporting on forced and child labor and working with the private sector so that they can understand how to eliminate those risks within their supply chains. And as I said, we don't work with the same volume of budgets as USAID, but we do have $40 million in technical assistance in Northern Central America. And those are projects that work in many cases directly with workers and communities. We have one project called Prep for Change, which looks at addressing urgent health risks, including occupational heat stress risks driven by climate change in the agricultural sector. So people who work in sugar, also looking at garment sector workers. We have a project that works directly with agriculture and maquila supply chain workers, again, on their right to organize, helping them develop a voice at work, but also how they can better engage employers and better engage their governments for safe, quality jobs. The last two things I will mention is our labor diplomacy and engagement. The Department of Labor, while we're a huge domestic agency, we have 10 labor attaches around the world. One of them is based in Guatemala, and as a result of her presence, we were meeting with the Arevalo administration on day one about things we can do together to improve the enabling environment for labor rights. So it's really the other side of the coin, or maybe it's the same side of the coin of what Michael just talked about. A thriving business enabling environment depends on a healthy industrial relations culture, and that is what we are able to do. And the last thing I'll mention is our multilateral engagement. We have a partnership, the Multilateral Partnership for Organizing Worker Empowerment and Rights, or EMPOWER, that works with like-minded governments and civil society groups, including trade unions, to see where we can cooperate together to improve outcomes for workers. So we're able, through that partnership, to work with governments like Canada, like Spain, labor organizations like the International Trade Union Confederation, or civil society organizations like the Worker Rights Consortium, look at particular opportunities where we can all coordinate together to improve outcomes on things like gender-based violence in the maquila sector. Those are just a few of the examples. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And exactly, those kinds of programs often don't get the same level of attention that others might. Security or migration-related programs often are the focus in the news, but a lot of times helping with work with local entities, with private sector, with governments, kind of build that infrastructure that's going to make Central America more competitive and frankly a better place to live for a greater part of the population, really has been a lot of the fundamental underpinning of the approach of the Biden administration over time. Arturo, I'm going to turn to you because one thing I also learned over particularly the last 10 years of my career working on Central America was humility, a lot of humility. And that was not just because of the limits of policy for any US administration, but because agency lives in Central America for the way that things, the direction of events are driven by local dynamics and by local individuals and organizations. So just reflecting a little bit on what you've heard so far, thinking about what's going on in Central America now, I realize we're asking you a lot in a fairly compressed environment, but could you share a little bit about how you see civil society, private sector, and government interacting in Central America now, and any thoughts you might have on the direction of U.S. policy?
Sí, buenos días, and thank you. I am grateful for the attention of the dialogue and for the attention of the US government in different approaches to Central America. We need it, it's really good. And we are neighbors, and we are good neighbors. And we can develop the engagements and develop the way to not only get along, but to thrive together. The US to Central America, and to Central America to the US. The root causes approach, when I saw it and when we saw it, we thought it was the next step and the good next step. You have to work there. The solutions are back there in the homeland, in our countries. And if you translate it to another language, you can say that root causes might equate to development, human development there. We're talking about education, we're talking about economic growth, we're talking about roads, we're talking about infrastructure in many ways. So that approach of developing that there on the basis also of developing it on two pillars. One of those is democracy, and the other one is rule of law. I believe it's the right approach. And of course, as you mentioned, Ricardo, I also do believe that Central American can be a tough teacher for everyone, including us, especially us Central Americans. So the approach was, on the one hand, and on paper, on the strategy, very good. I think it's right on. The implementation and the way it has moved forward over the past years has taught everyone, I think, a lesson of humility, as you mentioned. Why do I say that? Because it's different to have a beautiful design on the blueprint than to build it back there. It's not easy. And it's not easy because of the people of Central America. I think Central Americans are one of the hardest workers in the world. But there are certain interests and certain groups that don't believe that Central America is big enough for every Central American to be able to thrive and to develop. So in that sense, I do believe that the approach that the US took towards Guatemala on 2023 and what has gone by of 2024 has proven that a hands-on approach with dialogue with lots of sectors inside the society, with dialogue with the indigenous groups, the Afro-descendant groups, and civil society in those countries can present a more efficient and a more effective way of moving forward in these countries. Having said that, I'm going to move to your question, civil society. Civil society, I think it's fundamental for democracy, for rule of law, for the US approach in Central America. Civil society needs to be present and to inform and to educate nationally and internationally. Civil society, we can see it as a way of an early alarm, an early red flag. They have information, they are there, and they can present that information to everyone in order for everyone to see what's happening really on the ground. Also, I think the job for civil society is to organize and to advocate, especially on some topics that have been mentioned in the panel. Now, I'm just going to repeat a couple of them. Human rights, of course, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, indigenous people and Afro-descendant rights. And now, especially with the example of Nicaragua and the examples of other countries, I'm going to speak about mine, Guatemala in 2023 and what's going on now in 2024, democracy itself, we all need to be paying attention on the erosion and the threats that democracy itself is suffering in Central America right now. And then, of course, civil society needs to facilitate participation and representation of certain populations in the countries. This because we at Central America have weak political party systems that doesn't enable a lot of interaction between governments and society and among society and the international community. So civil society can play that role and should play that role and should be taken as a valid and solid interlocutor nationally and internationally. And last but not least, just going back to the two fundamentals, civil society is a key ally for the US policy and the root causes strategy on the two fundamentals that can lead to a successful strategy, and that's rule of law and, of course, democracy. Last but not least, and the good thing about sharing a panel with intelligent and smart friends is that things have already been said. And that's the bad thing, because I'm repeating what everyone has said already. But just the relationship between economic growth and human development, they are not the same thing. And we can have thriving economies. We can have robust economies. In Central America, that doesn't equate. And I'm going to put it in the simple terms that I heard in Totonicapan 2 weeks ago when I was there. That doesn't equate to a couple of small roads, infrastructure for the market, a little school, and a little hospital for the people in the community. That we need to work on from the ground up in Central America, thriving with the private sector there in order for those two, economic growth and human development, to be taken on side by side, hand by hand, in order for, well, the wealth, the profit, the well-being to be reaching everyone else, everybody on the ground.
Thank you. I think that we're hearing some themes get repeated here and some looks back at the past as well. So, Michael, I'm just going to ask you, because I think this has been one of the most important roles of U.S. government in somebody who's led efforts to kind of reframe and continue to lead policy in Central America. Now, can you talk about any lessons learned, different iterations of the strategy, and where we've seen improvements and why?
Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, I'll mention a few, and I'm sure others will have, more to add on this. And I'll tick through them quickly. But first, I think it's a question of scale and sustainability, right? So we've had some pretty wild swings, it's fair to say, in the years between the Obama-Biden administration launching was then the strategy for Central America, and then to a complete aid cutoff during the prior administration, and now the major commitment by President Biden to this region. And I think you need look no further than the GAO report on the impact of those cutoffs for concrete evidence and objective evidence for the negative impact that had. And so we are now seeing 3 years into the root causes strategy, the data come in, and it shows that we can have an impact when we operate at scale and we operate in a sustained way in areas like, for example, citizen security, where you can go back, more than a decade and track, sustained U.S. government commitments, both State Department and USAID, to a data-driven, evidence-driven approach to approaching what had been, the highest homicide rates in the world in areas of Central America, and seeing how that has turned around in the years since. For some sense of like, when we have a strategy, when we stick to it, when we invest in it, we can have an impact. So I think the scale and sustainability point is the place I would start. The second thing I would say is that we are, embedding the root causes strategy as comprehensive as it is in an even broader approach under things like our comprehensive migration management strategy that incorporates things like the work that USAID has done to invest in the expansion of legal, ethical labor pathways, almost tripling the number of H-2 visas from Northern Central America in the last 3 years, for example, recognizing that, root causes work takes time, and we are seeing an impact, but we're going to see more impact over over the years to come, hopefully. And in the meantime, there are people who feel like migration is their only economic alternative. But by and large, given the choice between doing that in a legal, orderly fashion that allows them to stay connected to their families and the communities, or doing so in a highly uncertain, highly dangerous way that cuts them off from their families and communities, that individuals will take the former option. And so expanding legal pathways through what we're doing under the H2 program, through what we're doing now through the SMOs, is an important piece of what we're doing in parallel to the root cause. Third thing I'll say is that we are constantly kind of adapting and integrating what the data tells us about why people are migrating. Merrick mentioned a few of the new kind of pillars of the current strategy compared to the prior one, GBV being, I think, a crucial one to mention. I'd also say climate change. We are increasingly seeing in very vivid terms the impact of climate change in Central America, and now adapting our programming to incorporate standalone GBV programs in all the Central American countries, as well as increasing our work on climate. And then finally, in the case of USAID, a real kind of flagship investment in local partners. So we have, under the Centro America Local initiative that Eric and I worked on together when he was at USAID, set ambitious goals for kind of pivoting our programming in Central America and actually globally to local partners. And to give you a sense of this, when we started this effort, we were at something like 3% for funding going to local partners. And we're now at 21%, and we'll soon be at our objective of 25%. It's challenging. It's not easy to work with USAID. We're trying to make it easier. But this requires a lot of kind of, really grassroots kind of work to identify and then equip local partners to work with us. But we are convinced that doing so allows us to be more adaptable, more sustainable, ultimately more effective in the work that we do. And so I think that has been a key innovation of the way we work in Central America that has actually now informed the way that USAID is operating globally.
Thank you very much, Michael. So Molly, this time I'm going to start with you on our last question before we turn to questions from the audience. And it's actually quite a bit about what you mentioned here, but perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more. What specific legal and governance measures are being implemented under the U.S. Central America strategy to strengthen rule of law, combat corruption, and enhance security in the region? And then Eric, I'll turn to you as well on that. Molly.
Absolutely, thank you. So I will talk about, again, what Department of Labor is doing, and specifically with labor law enforcement. I know that's not what people think of necessarily when they think of rule of law. They think something much grander or fighting corruption. But the reality is that for the majority of workers in Northern Central America, labor rights are something that exists on paper, and enforcement is a challenge, and it remains a challenge. It's a question of resources, it's a question of capacity, it's a question of political will, and it's a question of historic and really deep-seated mistrust between some of the parties. So in addition to the worker voice focus that I mentioned in the first question, a big part of our engagement with the governments and civil society in Central America is focused on labor law enforcement and working with governments to improve legal frameworks around labor law. That includes things like training labor inspectors and ensuring that there is an adequate number of inspectors, and developing and providing electronic case management systems that track labor inspections to make them more strategic, efficient, and effective. Now, I know that sounds extremely probably boring to most of you and a little bit wonky. I will explain why it's important. There is absolutely major corruption problems that make headlines. But for a lot of people, what you experience in your work is an inspector taking a small bribe to not report a violation. What you experience is your parent suffering from chronic kidney disease after working in agriculture and being unable to support the family. So you as a 14-year-old have to figure something else out. So focusing on these sort of technical level inspections, enforcement is a big difference to families' economic livelihoods. And it also is a big difference to what people's experience is in terms of faith in institutions and tackling corruption at a grassroots level. There are also major problems, and I don't want to shy away from that. In Northern Central America, in particular in Honduras and Guatemala, there's a long history of violence and threats against activists and organizations. And so even in the past year, and even despite some of these bright spots that we're talking about here today, we've seen, you know, a group of Honduran trade union leaders murdered in a pool hall, not necessarily, but it's hard to say because of their union activity. We saw just a couple of weeks ago a slate of union leaders in Guatemala fired after attending a labor rights training. And so these sort of things, you know, whether or not they're directly connected and the investigations are complicated, have a huge chilling effect. If the people who are in your communities who are actually fighting to make their workplaces a better place, who are invested in improving things, are facing these kinds of threats, that's a very serious impediment to other people who want to invest and take the risks to make their workplaces and their communities safer and better. All that said, one of the things I am proudest of about this administration is how quickly and how seriously we are responding to those kinds of incidents. And I do not want to downplay the work of previous administrations, but what I've seen in the almost 3 years that I've been at Department of Labor is how quickly and urgently we are working with Department of State, with USAID to respond to these incidents as soon as they are raised by civil society organizations. We work with our local counterparts in the governments to make sure that the inspections are serious. We work with employers, both on the ground as well as multinational brands, to ensure that workers and families that are affected can seek remedy, that a message is sort of clearly communicated to those who are seeing what's happening. This is not tolerated, and that indeed labor rights actors are valued and important parts of civil society, and that we absolutely have their backs. And I take your point about humility. We have a lot to go to improve those relationships. And indeed, after many decades of conflict, we have a long way to go to build trust. But that is something that I'm very proud of, is the work that we've been doing together to respond seriously with a strong and clear message about supporting civil society, rule of law, and indeed, functional labor inspections.
Excellent. Eric.
And I would say on governance, from the start, this has been a priority for this administration. And it's a real recognition that to do economic prosperity, to do security, to deal with corruption, you really need good governance. And so that's been at the core of everything we do, as challenging as it can be in certain instances. So, you know, and I know Ricardo knows this well, but this administration has used a variety of tools. You know, in 2021, under your leadership, Ricardo, the administration, we have a 3C policy for visa revocation. We made a determination to apply that to rule of law, to governance, to democracy issues in Northern Central America. That's a policy, obviously, we've used robustly, in addition to the Section 353 or Engel List report, which has allowed us to publicly name and shame individuals tied in the past with certain visa revocation. So, you know, we've used these tools in the Biden-Harris administration to promote accountability through visa restrictions on over 1,400 individuals involved in acts of corruption or undermining democracy in Central America. In addition to that, the Treasury Department, through various authorities, has sanctioned 16 individuals and entities in El Salvador and Guatemala for their role in, among other things, serious human rights abuses and corruption. Obviously, the sanctioning of Miguel Martinez, who was a key operator in the Yamate administration, partner of President Yamate, former president, was a critical step during the country's difficult democratic transition. So these tools matter, and we believe they're having an impact. They support the Guatemalan people, but also in other country contexts. In Honduras, we use visa restrictions to prevent further democratic backsliding after some called for violence after the selection of the interim attorney general in the fall. So, you know, these have been important. Our commitment extends, of course, beyond the sanctions themselves, extends to a number of things we're doing in terms of training. Since 2021, the State Department, USAID, we've trained over 27,000 justice sector personnel, government officials, and NGOs to work in these spaces, to work on accountability. And that includes an e-governance, other things to just make governments more effective in countering these key challenges. And then there's also been a lot of work with the private sector. Michael talked about the incredible work from Vice President Harris related to Central America Forward, related to generating new investments, $5.2 billion. Molly talked about that work as it relates to the labor space as well. So, the private sector, in our view, is a powerful ally under the root causes strategy. We're really proud of the work also that we've done, that the Partnership Central America has done in launching a rule of law pledge and doing really interesting work with the OECD, and, going up to the standards on due diligence for business contact for the OECD. So there's a role for governments, but there's also a role for the private sector. And we feel like that's really important as we collaborate moving forward.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to move to some questions from the audience. And I think what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions, and then depending on what they are, we'll ask folks on the panel to respond to them. And happy to take volunteers from the panel as well as the questions come up. Okay,
Morning. This is Eva Buendia from the Embassy of Spain. My question is relating human rights and security. We know that security, not only the economic reasons, forces people to migrate. So given the situation now in El Salvador, how can we work together, the international community and local partners, in order to make that system sustainable? We think that human rights are being compromised in El Salvador. There is no due diligence, but also we see that people are satisfied that they can go to the streets, they can have their small businesses. So if that is not the only model, or we don't want that as a role model, how can we work together, but really with the people, because they see the impact, and human development, we know that it takes time. The timing it really takes time. So that's my question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nicolas Lloreda. Thank you very much to the panel. It was very interesting. I have just 2 questions. First one on labor. Most of Central America and many countries in South America also have a higher percentage of informal job force than formal. So is there anything being done towards that bigger percentage of people that don't have any rights and are just informal in many cases because the employers cannot pay formal jobs, and in other cases because they don't choose to? And the second question is, because this is a root cause event, education. I mean, with everything that is happening in the world, AI, et cetera, every time Latin America is falling behind on education, and what can you comment about to try to level that play field a little bit? Thanks.
Thanks very, very much. I probably have a longer trajectory than most of the people here on Central America. And I remember my first visit was to Nicaragua in 1979. So, and during the period since then, at least, there's been a number of points of what you might call success, or at least progress in Central America, and what's going on in the region and all. One looks at the end of the wars in Central America, for one, around 1990. Guatemala went on a little further, but by and large, from that beginning in 1990, we began to have a movement toward democracy and opening. And I could go further on that, but just let me get to the question. It's more a sort of a suggestion, but why it's not, we don't hear more of it. What went wrong in Central America? Why, after 30 years, after the wars throughout the region virtually, are we still sort of lamenting on the state of democracy, the state of violence, the state of corruption? is there anybody, what has the US done right? But also, what has it done wrong? And also ask you, we heard a lot about what's being done right by the US at this point. What are we not doing enough of? What should we be doing more of?
So that's an easy one there at the end. Thank you very much. Especially the 500 years of history that we part of it. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and just take these in order in terms of the human rights and security balance and question. Eric, maybe I could turn to you.
A good question. And we certainly recognize the profound challenge of gang violence and really the multi-generational trauma that it's brought in El Salvador, but throughout the region. I would say, my view, our view is that ensuring citizens' security is obviously every government's duty. But El Salvador also has an obligation to respect the human rights of all people, including fair trial guarantees, including other legal obligations. So, our view is that we continue to urge the government to expeditiously and fairly review the cases of those incarcerated and release any prisoners who are unjustly detained. So, certainly understand, recognize the trauma from gang violence, recognize the feeling of security among many in El Salvador, but also recognize that there is a need for due process, and that's why we think it's so critical to have citizen security with due process as well.
Arturo, I don't know if you wanted to add to that. Just threw that ball over your way, but
It's so good. Thank you. On the same thinking, I know that it's a popular model. I know that it's quote unquote effective. It's a small country, 5.5, 6 million people there. And if you incarcerate 80,000 people in an 18-month span, crime is going to go down for sure. But at the same time, after 2 or 2.5 years, you have 0 convictions, 0 trials regarding those 80,000 people. That is a combination that is not sustainable. Or are you going to create a state where the state of emergency is the new state of normality? And what does that, what consequences bring that to the international scene according to your international obligations and the international law that you have ratified from many years before? And then internally, what is going to happen after this new state of peace or certain way of peace becomes the new normality? And when a family that has a kid between 18 and 22 and is poor, which is the majority, will become very afraid of that kid going to be incarcerated just because he is poor and just because he is brown and just because he lives in a certain neighborhood. And when that people start gaining conscience, when that fear gains traction, that is going to put a strain on the sustainability on the model. I do believe that human rights, democracy, and security and safety need to be on the same path and are not contradictory in any way. So what is done, what has been done is done, but now you can backtrack it. You can put, you can let the international community, for things to be done, right? You can let the international community, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, take a look to what is happening on those jails, and to regain the judiciary, to regain control of what's happening with those people inside of those jails and their rights in order for them to get a fair trial, right? You might not end up with 80,000 incarcerated. You might end up with 40,000, which is a lot still. But to regain the control of due process, that can be done, and that should be demanded by the international community and of course the national community, which I know it's a challenge. We are accustomed to do advocacy when you have governments that are rated poorly inside of their countries. The new challenge is how to do advocacy for these rights that are for everybody when everybody's saying that 90% of the population agrees with that.
That's a real one, a real tough one, but and a great question too, Molly, to you on the informal economy. Excuse me, on for workers working in the informal economy and what can be done for their cases.
Absolutely, and thank you. I really appreciate that question because even within the formal sector, organized labor movements are representing a tiny fraction of workers. And so making sure, and even indeed within formal sector enterprises, there are subcontractors of subcontractors and subcontractors. So even people who may be farming or producing for a very large recognized brand might not have the protections and recognition as employees. And this is an area where our partnership matters especially. So we work very closely with local unions and local organizations in country. And in Central America, in Northern Central America included, some of the very strong worker organizations that we work with include, for example, domestic worker organizations, market vendor organizations, increasingly delivery workers, and then all sorts of like Cuenta Propista of every possible stripe. Increasingly what we're seeing and what we are promoting as well is that formal and sort of organized labor movements that have a seat at a table, whether it's in a tripartite dialogue table or other mechanism, build those partnerships and deepen those relationships. We actually have a lot to learn about them. And what we are seeing as there's focus on some of these themes, including through the strategy like gender-based violence and harassment, occupational safety and health, those are themes that apply to workers and interest workers and are areas for organization and mobilization, regardless of how formalized the workplace is. So there is a lot of leadership from domestic worker organizations, as you would expect, on gender-based violence and harassment. And in many cases, they are bringing more formal organizations along with them in those national campaigns that look not just at labor law, but also protection against gender-based violence and harassment, ratification of the ILO Convention on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work. Many cases, those leaders are not coming directly from the formal labor movement. And I'll mention again, multilateral cooperation and engagement with other like-minded governments. So we work very closely with Spain, who has really been a leader on looking at protections for delivery workers, for people who ride school. I mean, this is DC now too, people who ride mopeds around and deliver food really quickly, how to make sure that they can do their jobs safely and with rights and protection. So back to the point on humility, there's a lot of learning that we're doing, but it's absolutely core to our focus. And I'll mention just very briefly on education. I won't say we have AI figured out. I don't know if anybody else here does. It's part of the conversation, but with education, a big part of our work, in fact, more than half of our technical assistance and almost all of our research looks at child labor. And through that work, we partner not just with labor ministries, but also with education ministries. I think Michael and USAID have a lot more in that space, but it is something that factors into DOL's work as well.
Actually, Michael, if you don't mind, I thought that I want to give ample time for the last question here. So I might just I did want to point out one element on education, which maybe it's a way to lead into this final question about what we could do better. Because one thing that has continued to really make an impression on me is the incredible success of Central American communities in the United States. You know it's not a human capital issue. You know it's not, because you see the extraordinary contributions to the U.S. economy, to U.S. society that come from the Central American community in the United States. So you know that there's something there already on that front. Education clearly is one key element, not the only one, but I think it's also important as we kind of come to this last question. What could we be doing better? Arturo, I'm going to give you the last word on this one. I'm going to work right down the line here, but I'm going to give you the last word on this one because I think it really is a crucial piece of that self-examination. Eric, I'm going to start with you.
Always can leave it to Peter to ask the unanswerable questions. So I appreciate that. Just a couple of things. I mean, in terms of sort of, you initially asked sort of what went wrong in Central America and what could, I guess there's a question, what could we be doing better, but also, where have we faltered along over the years? And to me, a big piece of this, and I think this comes out of two things coming sort of as lessons learned from the Guatemala experience. But one is really the lack of investment in the judiciary. I know one could say that there's been a lot of resources poured into the judiciary over many years, but I think the fact that you still just have to deal with lawfare in such huge ways, the fact that you have a president in Guatemala now who wants to move forward on a big anti-corruption agenda, but you still have difficult challenges from the Office of the Attorney General, from the judiciary itself, shows that there's not been enough attention on these processes. And that's why, personally, I'm excited about this OAS mission, not saying it's a panacea, but it's a recognition that we can't just look at elections. We have to look at what's happening in the judicial branch. The other piece I'd say, again, an example coming out of Guatemala, and I think an example of sort of an unfulfilled promise from the peace process, is Indigenous inclusion. And I think there's a real sense that it was the Indigenous community in large part that had a role in ensuring that Arevalo made it through this overly lengthy transition. And now there needs to be a sustained effort to include those communities in a big way, because we're in a moment where you're not able to not do so. And that's why we thought in the high-level economic dialogue, it was so critical, the work from the Arevalo administration, from our U.S. government, in putting forward Indigenous voices. So I'd say judiciary, investment in Indigenous communities are really critical moving forward.
Peter, I won't tell you what I was doing in 1979, but I think just maybe a word on that point, which is to say, and it's a fairly obvious one, but there are relative success stories in Central America, Panama and Costa Rica, right, which had very different Cold War histories, thought about the role of the military in different ways, and in particularly in Costa Rica's case, made long-term investments in things like health and education that have panned out over time. So I think it's just interesting to keep in mind also, the long tail that some of those histories and decisions have had in countries across the isthmus. In terms of lessons learned, Ricardo, I think in addition to Eric's good points, I would say, kind of staying adaptable is something that we've been reminded of again and again. And Eric has spoken in detail to, the past several months in Guatemala, but I think that's actually a really good example of doing that, and the way that in USAID's case, really across the government, we've been able to do this. In USAID's case, what that's looked like is being able to kind of surge and adapt our support in response to the transition period and now the Arevalo administration's priorities, and just recognizing that their ability to deliver on the promise of democracy for communities that really put themselves on the line, not just to vote Arevalo into office, but then sustain a successful democratic transition, is going to be really critical. And I'll connect that, I think, just briefly to the question on education, which is to say, USAID recognizing the critical importance of education has, significant investments in foundational learning and basic education. The education program here at the Dialogue has done really great work on this issue, and a lot of it does come back to education quality across Latin America. But we've also done, I think, some interesting and kind of innovative things under the root causes strategy in this space. One is to really kind of key in on the kind of middle school cohort, where we see a lot of school dropouts in Central America. So trying to look at things like conditional cash transfers, for example, as a potential solution to that challenge. Looking at, as I mentioned, vocational training as an option for those who have dropped out, and not just kind of giving up on those people, but finding ways for them to acquire skills, both for the informal and frankly even for the informal sector in things like digital skilling that can provide them a pathway to a more sustainable livelihood. We just launched a couple of weeks ago in Guatemala our Central American Service Corps. It's kind of an AmeriCorps model for Central America. I think this is one of the kind of big bets that we're really excited about. One of the more kind of innovative things that allows young people to stay rooted in their communities, to find opportunities to build soft skills and contribute to their to the areas where they grew up, and where they're hopefully going to be rooted longer term. And then the final thing I'll say is just, I think this is an area, and to Ricardo and Arturo's point about Central American agency, it's an area where we really need to just, need to see governments and civil society and the private sectors in the region, really step up. Ultimately, this is to Ricardo's point, this is an area that is so fundamentally, so clearly in the interest of the countries themselves, to not be exporting that abundant human capital, but actually be exploiting it for the good of the countries themselves. And we all know the statistics about what it was at Guatemala, 11% kind of tax to GDP ratio, a little bit higher in Honduras and El Salvador. We need to see governments themselves investing. We need to see private sector operating in its own benevolent self-interest. Eric mentioned here the Alliance for Education that we've been able to forge in Honduras with the Honduran government, USAID, the Honduran private sector, some international donors around education, just seeing how catalytic this can be in terms of the investments in that particular sector.
Very briefly, partnership, and I'll take Arturo's point about standing, or maybe the Obama initiative, the Stand with Civil Society. I think that is what was initiative 10 years ago, whenever that was really focused on supporting local civil society actors as the folks who are best equipped to know what the solutions are in their own countries. And that continues to be true. I think there's always a temptation, especially in Washington, to graduate countries based on legal reforms or say, okay, you had a democratic election, therefore you have democracy, when in fact we need to be invested in these partnerships. For us at Department of Labor, it's partnerships with workers' organizations, with labor ministries as well. But I think one of the things that you've heard consistently through this panel is that those partnerships extend into the private sector. They're partnerships with governments, they're partnerships with a host of community organizations, indigenous organizations, and that is what builds the continuity, builds the stability that, is not the what's wrong or what went wrong as much as what can we do right and what can we do more of.
What went wrong? Inequality. That's what's wrong with my region. And what can we do best is bring inequality, the concept of inequality, the analysis of inequality, the discussion of inequality back to the table. And to listen, as all my partners here at the panel have already said. The Agency of Central America is to go there and to listen to everybody. And with that information, put together the implementation plans, the tactics, because the strategy is really good. The tactics in order to make it effective as it was and has been effective over 2023 and 2024 in Guatemala. And inequality in several ways, like economic inequality, social inequality, political inequality. Let's not forget that our economies in Central America are basically subsidized economies by the remittances that Central Americans send from the US. I'm not gonna talk percentages of GDP because Manuel is around here and he will probably correct me, but it's way up there, way up there. If we were to think as a counterfactual hypothesis, from one day to the other, Central America doesn't receive a single dollar of remittances, our economies would be broke. More than 75% of our population will go straight direct into extreme poverty from one day to the other. We have to keep that in mind. And with that in mind, we have to foster and facilitate more participation and more representation of the indigenous communities, the Afro-descendant communities, the workers, the informal workers that are the biggest base of the Central American, not only economy, but population. In Guatemala, I don't want to talk percentages, but I know it's more than 70% of informality in Guatemala, for example. So to facilitate the channels for those populations in order to be able to present their demands, to be able to have interactions with the state in the national and the local level, national level, international level. Because I am convinced that in Central America, more participation and more representation means more accountability, more rule of law, less corruption, and with that, more democracy.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time. We're just about, how are we? We're out of time. Sorry. See, that's it. It's always good not to be in charge. And look, I just wanted to say thank you. I know that there were some great questions that went unasked, but we got some very good ones that helped continue an excellent discussion. Again, Rebecca, and to the whole team here at the Inter-American Dialogue, really a huge thank you. This topic will remain a matter of great discussion and importance going forward. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for all the work that you've done over the years, and for your participation here today. Thank you.
Missed you, but everybody mentioned how